On November 15th, the Mexican government released its budget proposal for fiscal year 2025, which runs from January 1st through December 31st. The government pledged to narrow its fiscal deficit from around 6% in 2024 to around 3% in 2025. According to the budget proposal, there will be no additional taxes, and it also makes the assumption that the economy will grow between 2 and 3% next year. Within the same proposal, the government dramatically increases social spending but cuts the budget for government goods and services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure, among others. Is this realistic? What does that mean? Here to discuss where the government plans to make cuts, whether it is realistic to expect a 3% growth, what it means for investment, and more is Mariana Campos, head of the prominent think tank México Evalúa, which focuses on examining government performance. For 10 years, Mariana served as coordinator of México Evalúa's Public Expenditure and Accountability Program. She also joined our Center for the U.S. and Mexico as a visiting scholar in 2022. I'm Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Mexico Centered. Welcome, Mariana. Happy to have you here.
Hello, Tony. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, welcome again to the Baker Institute. Since we're talking about the Mexican budget for 2025, obviously a budget expresses a government's priorities. They may say whatever they may say, the rhetoric may go in all different directions, but at the end of the day, what really counts is what's in a budget. That is what really tells you where the priorities of a government are. So, in your analysis of the 2025 federal budget in Mexico, what are your initial thoughts?
Tony, I would like to say that this economic package, which includes the income law and the budget, the expenditures, in my opinion, is a survival package, just to send a message to the financial sector, especially to the rating agencies, that after the election, yes, the government is going to try to diminish its deficit. So I think they are trying to communicate that. However, it's definitely very far of what Mexico needs in terms of investment. And I'm not only talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about also in human capital. So this package is trying to survive, but we don't know if it's going to make it because, as you know, the government is putting in the table an economic growth that we might not see since it's bigger than what the average analysts here in the US and Mexico expect from our economy to grow. So maybe it's a little bit over-optimistic.
Yeah, this is the one thing that I was wondering. Obviously, a government needs the revenue to be able to spend. And this is a proposal of both income and expenses. In the income component, they're not raising any taxes. There isn't a proposal. And President Sheinbaum of Mexico has clearly said that there will not be a tax hike. And she is assuming the economy will grow at 2 to 3%, perhaps 3%. Not even in the so-called neoliberal governments did the economy grow at 3%. Why is she assuming that? Is that a realistic assumption?
I don't think it is a realistic assumption. And I think that maybe it's assuming that because it's the best way to put that your debt is not going to be very heavy in the economy. So one of the effects of not growing what Hacienda is saying is that the debt is going to be a lot more heavy in a smaller economy. So this indicator that says that our debt is going to be in 51.4% of GDP might be bigger. And this is a great way to just not say it right now. But it happens in Mexico that Hacienda tends to be over-optimistic. If we see the 2023 and 2022, maybe we thought it was optimistic and it was more accurate. I think it was the case of 2023. But if you review the past years, it's usually a little bit optimistic. But this disguises a lot of the problems when you overestimate the growth.
Yeah, of course, there is an overestimation of expected economic growth, no new taxes, as she has said. So most observers would simply say the rest of the revenue either gets cut back over the course of the year, the actual expenditures get limited, simply not done, or you incur additional debt. And it seems to me that the debt has been growing bit by bit. I guess that's the only other source of revenue that I can see, given that oil revenue in Mexico is practically at a net zero. Mexico is exporting considerably less oil than it was, so it's all debt. If you were going to spend this way with no new taxes and no growth and no additional revenue, i.e. oil revenue.
Yes, it is important to say that Mexico has a very low tax revenue collection, and this is a structural problem. The thing is that in the past administration, AMLO didn't do a fiscal reform. However, oil revenues were diminishing since Peña Nieto's administration. In each administration, the oil revenues for the federal government plummeted around 50% in each. So for the first time in 2024, Pemex represents a cost to the federal government.
Right. Let's unpack the budget for a minute. If the budget were a pie and you were cutting the pie into slices, where is the money going? How much of the pie is going to fixed expenses, debt servicing, social programs and pensions, subsidies to the parastatal companies, and really just investment in basic government programs and services? And when you look at the pie and the way it's being cut and the way it's being distributed, how do you read it?
It's a drama because if you see what goes to pensions, that's the main expenditure. That comes to 6% of GDP for the next year.
Of GDP, not the federal budget, GDP.
Of GDP. And then if you look into the financial cost of the government, that is going to be 3.8% of GDP. So just in these two payments, which are not going to impact the economy, you're going to spend 10% of GDP. If you add what the federal government has to send to the governments of the states and municipalities as participations, you're talking about another 3.7% of GDP. So we're talking about almost 14% of GDP in just three payments. But the problem is that the government, the tax revenues without the social security taxes, we're talking about 14% of GDP. So it's really compromised, the Mexican federal budget. You don't really have money to finance public
discretionary
policy.
Spending. You just don't have it.
You don't have it. It's been compromised. And that's why if you see the size of the debt is a bigger amount than what you're going to put in investment. And that is telling you that the government is just breaking the rule of law. That means that each peso that goes to debt should be going to investment. This is a key rule of law because then if you put the money of debt in investment, you are expecting that your future income is going to grow. And then you will have money to repay your payment. But if you don't invest the debt, then what is going to happen is what we're living right now, that you're just going to spend the money of the future in the present, and you're going to have a fixed budget.
And I think you're also compromising future growth when you do not invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and research and development. I mean, if you neglect that, because I think all those areas are being cut back. Am I correct?
Definitely, especially the health budget. The health budget is being cut 0.4% of GDP. The second area that it's being dramatically cut is investment in infrastructure. It's going to be 0.4 of GDP. And education, it's going to have some gains and some cuts. So in average, it's going to remain stable in terms of GDP. But I'm telling you something, Donnie. The problem there is that you're cutting things like the training for teachers. You're not really investing in the infrastructure of schools or an education of more quality. The government is giving the money is for scholarships, but non-conditional scholarships, just giving, as a transfer, because they love to give these amounts of money to the people.
Cash transfers, yeah.
Exactly. Scholarships are good, but you cannot substitute the quality of the service with scholarships, because for children and youth, they really appreciate the educational experience. One of the main things why young people in Mexico leave high school is because they don't feel they gain anything with the experience of education.
Right. I mean, what good is it to give each student 3,000 pesos a month or whatever it is? It's about $150. And then you go to school and the ceiling is leaking and the chairs are broken and there's no air conditioner or no heater in the winter. There is teachers that are not really prepared and there are no textbooks. So what good is it to have 3,000 pesos, $150, if you're not getting the right education for your own future when you have to go into the market and make your own living?
Well, maybe you are suggesting you can have this money and leave school because they are non-conditional scholarships. And I'm telling you that we have less students than before. We have lost around 1 million students in the educational system in Mexico in the past years. So just to clarify, my answer is that you're going to put a lot more money in payments that will not impact the economy or the human capital in Mexico, and you're going to put less money in infrastructure, health, and education.
And research and development, which are the things that ultimately generate growth. I think it's been demonstrated that what makes an economy grow is investment in R&D, research and development, solid infrastructure, and of course, human capital. And those are the things that are suffering. So in many ways, the budget is compromising future growth.
Definitely. And this tells us that there is a very short-run vision, just surviving the next year. Because if you think about it, of course, it's costly to provide these public services to people. But I think it's much more costly not to do it.
So the question that arises in my mind is, how is she different from López Obrador? I mean, what is the difference between his budgets and this one, which is her first full budget, 2025? Is there a difference? Is she taking a different course? Is she making radical changes to the way he spent money, to the way he collected money, to the way he calculated income and expenses? What's the difference between the two administrations? Or is she just following the same playbook inherited by him?
I think that the main premises of these package are the same. Don't do a fiscal reform, ignore the problem that the federal government is forgiving oil revenues to support Pemex. And that kind of proposal is the same, but there are some differences at the margin. For example, interesting that we see a very important cut to the military budget. You know that with AMLO, that was growing a lot. And we saw this cut, which is, I don't know if it's a good news or not, because it touches also the security budget. And you know that Mexico has a lot of challenges in that arena. So I don't know if it's a good news or not. But also I see that even though we have a general cut in the infrastructure project, if you look at the distribution of the budget, you see that the money, it's going towards the Ministry of Infrastructure. So it seems that she wants that ministry regain some power upon the infrastructure projects, maybe. However, I think that...
But it's money from one pocket to the other, right? If López Obrador charged the military with major infrastructure projects, and so they got a lot of that money, and now you redirect that money to the Secretariat for Telecommunications and Infrastructure, or whatever it is, it doesn't represent a substantial increase. It just represents a reallocation of the money for the same tasks. Am I right?
Exactly. I mean, and overall, we have a cut in infrastructure budget, but who is spending? For me, it's surprising that the military is going to get these kind of cut after years of giving a huge budget to them.
Well, let me go back to the issue of security, because obviously from this side of the border, Mexico's security is now severely compromised. Mexicans are now suffering from really an abandonment by the state of its fundamental duty to provide public safety and security, which is in a social contract. That's the number one issue, perhaps number one, number two, number three issue. A state must provide public safety and security so that people can engage in other economic, social, political activities. Where is security? How much are they getting, and where is it going? How much is the, Secretariat of Citizen Security getting? How much is the National Guard getting? Is that going to be effective? Is it going to make a difference if they're getting enough money? Do they need more money? What do you see there?
Well, Tony, the security function is going to get 0.5 point of GDP. So that's really disappointing in a country that has so many challenges in violence and in crime prevention and in the general criminal justice system. I'm going to tell you that I am convinced that one of the problems of the criminal justice system is that we haven't invested what we need to invest. And if you see police officers at the state and at the municipal level that should be doing the prevention and the civic justice system, they are totally unfunded. And that is a chronic problem in Mexico. And this is related to the very low capacity of the states and municipalities to actually collect property tax and other taxes at the state and at the municipal level. So historically, we have never funded police as we should have. And that is a structural problem. What happened in the past years is that the federal government cut the budget that went to the police of the states and municipalities, because that has always been dependent of the federal budget, which is a very different situation from the US. And now the project of these two last governments, the present and the past one, is that the military is going to be in charge of public security. However, there are prevention and, as I said, the civic justice systems that are not run by the military. All the prevention and, the community police officers that make a job in the community, the military is not doing a job there. So these corporations need their own budgets. And those budgets have been cut since 2021.
But it seems to me that on so many rubrics, the Mexican government, even though it's a member of the OECD, is at the bottom of the OECD countries on healthcare investment, on education investment, on security investment, on infrastructure, on the administration of justice. On so many issues, Mexico is increasingly ranking at the bottom of the OECD countries. That can't be good.
No, of course not. But I'm afraid to tell you that things are even worse because, of course, we're in the bottom of the OECD, but we are also lagging in Latin America. So if you see the average tax revenue in Latin America, this stands around 22% of GDP. But in Mexico, we are around, with the social system taxes, around 16. So we are like 6 points of the GDP behind the average country in Latin America. If you compare Mexico with Brazil, that is dramatic. Brazil collects 32 percentage points of the GDP, double than Mexico. And that is dramatic because that Brazil and Mexico can be compared in many instances. This was traditionally compensated by the governments with the oil revenues. But now the oil revenues exist. Pemex still has good oil revenues because if you compare Pemex to Equinor, the oil company from the government of Norway, Pemex and Equinor have around the same level of oil revenues. The problem is in the costs and the productivity of their enterprises. And then when you compare the profits, they are very different. The federal government has decided to give up that revenue and then not to do a fiscal reform, which is the impossible equation.
And I think on the contrary, I think both CFE, the power company, and Pemex, the oil company, are now having to receive, in addition to other projects like the Tren Maya and the airport outside Mexico City, the AIFA airport, and those, now they're having to receive subsidies just to operate on a day-to-day basis. So instead of contributing, these are parastatal companies, instead of contributing to the revenue of the state, they're now taking money from the treasury just to maintain their own operations.
Exactly. So you are giving up money for those enterprises, especially Pemex. Then you are paying a lot of pensions. Because let's remember that in the past administration with AMLO, there's a new pension system for the uninsured, which is a good thing to do, but not when it's not funded. The federal budget responsibility law in Mexico obligates the governments that if they are going to put a new item in the expenditure budget, they have to do it, but with a new source of funding, income. They didn't do that. They didn't respect the responsibility law. So now we have this new system with no new sources of income. And that has actually taken the public finances to new risks.
A couple more questions on that because I think it's important. One will be about the risk. But before I get there, I want to ask you another question. It has to do with the states. In Mexico, there is something that they call the Fiscal Pact, Fiscal Federal Pact or Federal Fiscal Pact, where the state, that is the Mexican central government, collects most of the revenue in the state because they have the infrastructure to collect the revenue, and then they remand part of that collection to the states and the municipalities. I saw the table and I saw that just about every single state in Mexico is getting its budget cut. Jalisco by as much as 13%, Chihuahua by 1%, and everything else in between. Clearly, that's a problem, especially because the Jalisco governor, mad at this, has just threatened to break with the fiscal pact and collect his own revenue. What would that look like? Do you think that the fiscal pact is itself in danger? What are the states going to do? How are the states going to push back? How many states are going to push back? How's that going to work if the states begin to perceive that the federal government is collecting all the money, spending it or wasting it or burning it, and they're getting less and less money to be able to supply the goods and services that states and municipalities are supposed to?
I think you are in a key topic on public finance in Mexico, and I believe that the fiscal pact has shown that is becoming less and less functional for the states and the municipalities. I'm going to just mention some of the things I see and I have seen in the past years. First of all, we're talking about these oil revenues that the federal government has quitted to collect from Pemex in order to support the inefficiency of the state company. Well, that damages the amount of money that the state and municipalities get from participaciones, the share revenue, because the share revenue depends on tax collection, but also on oil revenues. So the decision, they were never asked, this is a decision that the federal government is taking without taking into consideration how it's going to affect the states.
So it's not a negotiation, it was a top-down decision.
Exactly. So that's a problem. And that has been happening since the governments have been sharing those revenues without asking. And the second thing that I've seen is also the centralization of the transfers. With the Peña Nieto administration, part of the education budget was again centralized. Then with AMLO, the health funds for the states and municipalities were centralized again. There was not a reform to do that. It's just like a contract that the government is signing with some of the states, but up to now is 23 states.
An MOU, yeah.
Yeah, an MOU. So what happens is that now that the government is controlling 23 out of the 32 budgets, decided to cut the expenditures in health that in the past were used to buy medications and to pay for doctors and also to buy inputs in general for health in the states. So the government is abusing the centralization of these funds in order to gain some liquidity and to control the deficit. But of course, I believe this has been done just without asking. You know that the federal government has a lot of political support because it has a lot of governors from Morena's party. And also in the past administration, many of the MOUs for more money, because you have the transfers that the states and municipalities get because the law says that. But the federal government usually used to sign different MOUs with the states and municipalities to finance different projects or programs. Those were almost canceled in the past administration. So they were not getting that extra money. So, if you see, it's been many, many years where the damages have been done to the budget of the transfers of the federal government to these governments.
Well, this is probably why so many governors, especially opposition governors, because Morena governors, they're from the same political party as Sheinbaum and López Obrador. They're not going to say much. They're probably just going to bite their tongue and cooperate. But some opposition governors are saying, wait a minute, this is not going to work for us. And this is where I think the fiscal pact. But if it falls apart, what can take its place? The states don't have the capability to collect their own taxes. Do they? Can they?
I think that they are supposed to. However, I don't think it's something easy to get out of. I think that the fiscal pact is one of these things that is not easily broken. I think that this might get first into a crisis among the federal government and some of the states. However, the states that are complaining are states from the opposition. Right now,
they're also the wealthier states, right?
Also, because this has happened with Nuevo León, which is from Movimiento Ciudadano, and also in Jalisco. So it's mainly these governors from that party that have been complaining in the last years. Chihuahua also did it with Javier Corral when he was the governor, but it has been some years ago, and now Corral is...
It's a Morenista.
Exactly, so he moved. But I don't know how serious is this, But I do understand that there are significant reasons to don't feel this is fair and to complain. I think there are real reasons to complain because the pact, yes, I think it hasn't been functional for the states and municipalities.
Well, I mean, the pact was meant to make collection more efficient, so the states didn't have to invest in their own revenue collection capacity. The federal government would do that, and then it would return these monies to the states. But if the federal government gets to keep more and more and more and more of the money, and it uses it as inefficiently as it is using it, and giving less and less to the states, I can see why some governors are beginning to say, wait a minute, this is not working for us.
And also, if you take into consideration that the states and municipalities have a lot of restrictions in terms of what they can actually tax. And this is very different from the United States also, because here in the states can actually, for example, charge a sales tax. Well, in Mexico, they can't charge a sales tax, but the federal government can do it. And it doesn't want to review the IVA regime, the value-added tax regime, that it has many, many dysfunctionalities that should be addressed. But, it's a very, very politically costly topic. So the federal government has been decades not willing to discuss anymore that topic. And the states and municipalities cannot charge a sales tax. So, it's like, I'm not going to do it, but I don't leave you to do it also. So I think that it's not only the money that comes, but it's also the no space to do tax policy in the states.
You have to consider that in Mexico, the sales tax is 16%?
Yes.
So it's quite a bit of a collection of money, and the federal government gets to collect all that money, keep it, or send whatever it wants or can to the states. And so, yeah, you're right. Even in the United States, even municipalities collect their own taxes. Because when you go to the store here in the United States, in Texas, for example, 8.25% sales tax, which is half of what it is in Mexico. And I think a portion of it, I don't know if it's 1% or 2% or 2.5%, stays with the municipality, with the city. And then part of it goes to the state. And it doesn't really go to the federal government. So it's a different regime. But yeah, in Mexico, it's completely centralized.
It's completely centralized. And then the property tax collection is just not working because more than half of our territory is not private property.
And there's only so much you can charge before you get people angry because people are already poor and they have a small home. How can you raise property taxes so much?
In the richest neighborhoods, even there's problems because the municipality doesn't really have a control on the laws that regulate the collection of property tax. It's also very different from the states because municipalities in Mexico are a very administrative government. They don't have a Congress. So the laws are decided at the state level. So if the regime is not working, anything you want to change about that property tax collection, you have to discuss it politically with the state. And you're one of maybe 200 municipalities in that state.
So I have one last question, going back to the country risk. Sheinbaum may be able to present a budget that is very questionable in its assumptions, i.e. the rate of growth that the country is going to experience. Most people would say it's probably going to be 1%. In a very lucky scenario, 1.2%. She's assuming almost a 3% growth. That's questionable. Probably there's a hidden intention to borrow in the international market, so more debt, which in turn will obviously mean more money to service that debt in the future. And subsidies to the parastatal companies, foregoing the oil revenue and instead dumping a lot of cash into an unproductive company, Pemex, and on and on. We've been talking about that, and we can talk forever about the details of the budget. And she may be able to deceive a lot of Mexicans, a lot of citizens, and politically operate to hide a lot of the true assumptions on the budget. But she's not going to fool the international investment and credit raters. The people who really look at the conditions of the state, the country, the security situation, the education, the healthcare, the infrastructure, the investment, the FDI flows, the tax revenue, the tax collection system, the servicing of the debt, all the things that go into all these agencies, international agencies, rating both the country risk, the country credit, and the country investment. Mexico has been downgraded bit by bit over the last few years. It's actually falling down. The last was that it came from fairly positive to stable. but very close to negative now. If that changes, obviously, international credit will be more expensive. So if she intends to borrow, that's an issue. And of course, you also have investment rating. And that's a very serious thing because so many of us have our investments and our retirement investments in these huge funds that go into Mexico, go into Brazil, go into places. And if Mexico loses that rating, then that capital is leaving. It's getting out. And they are saying, you're going in the wrong direction. Your economy, your rule of law issues, your fiscal issues are going in the wrong direction. We see it. You may be able to deceive a lot of people inside, but we're watching the country and we're telling you, you got to correct that. Is she going to do it? What's going to happen? What do you see there? I mean, that'd be a very dramatic scenario because if you think of Mexico losing its investment rating, not credit, it's investment rating, a lot of the capitals, huge funds are going to pull their money out. And if Brazil recovers its own, then all that capital is going to flow to Brazil. Mexico is risking quite a bit here. What do you foresee in 2025?
As I said, I think 2025 is about surviving and maybe buying time. That is what the president wants to do. Survive and buy time to think more about this issue. So it's very important to see what happens in the budget of 2026. Is a fiscal reform going to be finally done? Something, not, of course, the reform that specialists as me are waiting for, but maybe some reform. But also we have to look on the other options. Because I understand that the government wants to refuse the reform and the political cost that comes with the reform, especially in a political regime that is looking for weaken the democracy, the accountability. They just closed the INAI Institute, the Freedom of Information Act institution in Mexico. This is so inconsistent because there's a government that needs money and needs to collect taxes. When you raise taxes, you need to offer accountability, transparency, democracy, participation. But the government is having an institutional agenda completely against that. So are they going to go after 1 year and say, yes, we're going to reopen the INAI and we need money? Maybe it's thinking in other plans. First of all, what other assets does the government have? And I think that one thing we have to consider is that the last centralization of the health funds was politically very cheap. So maybe they are going to centralize more of the funds. And remember, they can have the support of the Congress and they can have the support of the majority of the governors. So maybe a deeper centralization of the public expenditures can happen in Mexico in order to gain liquidity. Let's say that...
But they can only take you so far and then it's going to run out.
Second, the electoral system, Tony. I'm sure that this regime is not economic sustainable. And we just named many examples right now in our discussion. But what happens if there is an electoral reform previously, then the fiscal crisis or whatever it comes, then it doesn't matter that you go into bankruptcy. I mean, just see Venezuela and see Cuba. I mean, we have seen many damages in that population. We have seen dramatic things done, and it doesn't matter. If you get and conquer the electoral system, it doesn't matter that you are not economically sustainable. That is important when you really have free elections. If you have free elections, you have to worry of the economic model. But if you don't have it, you don't have to worry it. So what is going to happen first? That's a question. And related to the risks that the rating agency might be watching it's very simple. I think there's 3 problems we have in public finances. First of all, we have the structural problem that I just described. Mexico has a historically low tax collection. The second problem is what happened with the AMLO administration. Revenues grew very little. Revenues grew like 45% with Fox, like 20% with Calderon, and like 15% with Peña. With AMLO, we're going to have the final figures soon, but we estimate a 7% growth in the whole term. So revenues are really, really weak.
And expenditures through the roof.
Yeah, through the roof. And the third problem is what is happening right now. We have a president, a new woman president, Claudia, that the Congress approved, but with her support, a complete weakening of the democracy, the rule of law, and the institutions. So the rating agencies are watching all this. So the summary of this situation is that Mexico's federal government capacity to repay the debt. This is the only thing the rating agencies see, the capacity. The capacity has been weakening year by year. And with these last reforms and with this budget, we know that investment is not going to be faster, not even from private sources. And nearshoring was a dream. So I think that Mexico is in a real situation to losing the grade of investment. And this is going to damage not only the government, but also the private firms.
Yeah. Sounds to me like a runaway train that either we turn around or it's going to crash. And it's going to be, what is it, back to the future, back to the 80s perhaps, back to the 70s, 80s.
But the electoral system is the key.
Yeah. If the Mexican electorate decides to implement a correction in the next election, that'll be 2027. Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss this really important item in the Mexican fiscal landscape. The Judy Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the Center and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager. This episode was produced by Lisa Wakita and Karina Zimel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more. Thanks for listening.